Welcome back. This is Lucid. We're going to be doing our second episode for our multiplayer guide on Dominions. In this episode, we're going to be talking about all the different game concepts that I outlined previously, and we're going to be going into a lot more detail than we had talked about before. But we're going to stay somewhat high level, in that I'm not going to be showing you in-game footage or things like that, because I want to get through all these game concepts in some depth quickly, and that's going to take some time. The next videos which follow on after this, which talk about pretender creation, early game, mid game, and late game, there we're going to have a lot of in-game footage. I'll show you examples of all these things that I'm talking about, and that will be kind of the most in-depth. So without further ado, the first game concept we're going to talk about, balancing your power curve. What is a power curve? A power curve is how strong or how powerful your nation is or could be at various phases in the game, early, mid, and late. So when we say balancing a power curve, it's balancing out how powerful you are in the middle and early and late game so that you're not terribly weak and vulnerable in any particular time. For example, to win a game, if you're too weak in the early game, it doesn't matter how strong you're going to be in the mid game often. And if you're very strong in early and mid, but you're weak in late, then if it's a big game, you may not be able to close it before a lot of the late game stuff comes online and you may not be able to win. So a lot of times you need some late game options with your nation in order to win. So when we talk about balancing a power curve, what you want to do is you want to exploit your national strengths and you want to protect against your national weaknesses at the various phases in the game so that there's not a particular point in the game where you're weak and where you're as strong as you possibly can be at each phase. So there's a few things that go into that. One is scales. So scales are, the turmoil, growth, productivity, things like that. If you choose to go high scales on a nation, it's usually a later payoff. If you want more income in year one, it's almost always better to go with a strong blessing or a strong awake pretender. Now, this is all relative, but in general, putting things into scales gives you less returns in the first year. Now, this isn't always true. For example, if you totally crash your scales and go with an awake pretender with a crazy bless, you may have less income, just because even though you'll have a ton of provinces, your income from them will be so horrible that you will have less income than a nation that went scales and has far fewer provinces. So anyway, that's scales. Generally, you think of it as a longer-term investment. A bless, if you think about what a bless really is, it's an effect you're getting on your units that you often can get, but not always. You often can get through spells, but you don't have to worry, especially if you can cast Divine Blessing, about the area of effect of spells, about having the right mages, about having the right gear on mages so that they can cast these spells. It's something that's immediately available. You don't have to do the research. So this is a way, really blesses are a way of taking something that would traditionally only be available after significant research later in the game and giving it to certain key units early in the game. So blesses in general, if you think about them, are a way to accelerate your power curve and get certain things earlier in the game than you otherwise would. So taking a better bless in general will make you stronger in the early game, but the payoff is you're not getting scales, which are usually better in the late game, and most blesses can be replicated in the late game by spells. So the other thing to think about with your power curve is play style. There's many different ways to play, and we'll talk about these in a lot more detail as we talk about winning the economic war. But you can kind of deathball with a big army, you can raid, you can counter-raid, you can have super combatants, you can have mage armies with big evocations. And one thing to think about when you're thinking about your power curve, how powerful you are at different phases of the game, is how many of these different playstyles can your nation do? Now, you don't need to do all of them, but if you're very one-dimensional, if all you can do is deathball, or all you can do is raid, and you can't deathball, or you have no ability to counter-raid, the less strategies you have at your disposal, the more one-dimensional your nation is going to be, and the easier you're going to be to counter. So when you're building your nation, when you're thinking about what units you produce, what spells you research, all these things, you need to say, is it going to open up certain play styles at different phases in the game, which are going to accelerate my power curve or make me stronger or less vulnerable to particular types of attacks? It's useful thinking not just how can you do the one thing your nation's already good at, doing more of that. It's also saying, what are the things I'd like my nation to do so I have more versatility? But all that factors into a power curve. For example, you may have a strategy like raiding, which is dominant early. If you're playing the nation Arco, you may have your Wind Riders who can jump around raiding everything. You may get quite big off that. If you can't transition that into something else to get another playstyle in the mid-game, which is not equally dominant, then you may fall off. The next topic is spell access, and this is such a huge topic. It really should kind of have its own section, but it comes into balancing your power curve. So when you're looking at spells, you need to think about what spells your nation's going to benefit most from, and then how research efficient are they? How many spells do you get from going up one school, or do you need to spread your research out across many schools, like Conjuration and Alteration, to get the key spells that are going to make your army strong? If you watched my MA Satis Let's Play, there's obviously a huge incentive to go for Enchantment 5 because you get Horde of Skeletons and Foul Vapors, which are two spells that most nations can't use together. But Satis is one of those nations that makes great use out of both of them. It's very research efficient because you get two very good spells by going up one school. So that's the kind of thing you want to look at for spells. Which ones are going to benefit your nation, and how efficient are they in terms of how low in the research ladder, or how many can you get by researching one school. And if you can find a way to do that, you will accelerate your power curve. You will have better spells earlier, which is generally what you want to do. You want to be stronger earlier in the game, and that will also make you stronger later in the game. If you can find research synergy, it's not really a trade-off between early and late game. The other question is, what kind of path access do you naturally have? If you're a nation with very low diversity, then later in the game, you're going to have less total gem income than other nations with the same amount of land who have high diversity, because they're going to be able to look for all the different kinds of gems in their land, and you're only going to look for maybe half of them. They're also going to have much more strategic access to a bunch of different kinds of spells that you wouldn't have access to. So that's a big question. You want to look at which of these spells that are going to make your nation really strong do you have access to, and if your nation doesn't have access to it, one of the easiest ways, or one of the most reliable ways to get access to it, is to build it into your Pretender. From that, you can usually summon more mages later in the game to have that path that your nation doesn't normally have, or you can use your Pretender as that mage in certain key battles. The other thing to think about for Magic is, when are they going to hit? You can usually afford to spend a lot of time researching while your nation is already strong, but you're very vulnerable if you spend a lot of mages researching for a far-off research objective while your nation is weak. So it's important to think about the timing of when you're going to get certain key spells that are going to make your nation very strong. If you're going for Fog Warriors, and your nation's very weak until you have Fog Warriors, you're going to have a hard time committing to researching Alteration until you get to Alteration 7 before you would potentially need those spells. So it's useful thinking about, if you're weak in the mid-game, you need to think about your research objectives in terms of what is going to strengthen my mid-game so that I'm not weak. That's kind of an important frame of mind to be in when you're looking at research objectives. And the final thing I'll say on spells for balancing your power curve is, how much of your time do you spend researching versus having your mages in battle? And this is a definite short versus long-term trade-off. If you have your mages in the lab researching, you're going to have better spells and summons, in a year or two. But if you lose major armies, you're going to have less effective income because you're going to have to replace them. So you're going to have less mages in the lab, and you're going to have less income because you have less territory. So you have to make a call, and usually it has to do with how effective are your battle mages with what research you currently have, and how strong is your nation without the battle mages out at that particular time. So if you're a nation that's very strong in the mid-game, you might be able to afford to have more of your mages hidey-hold away researching than a nation that is very weak unless they have strong mage support. So these are all important things to think about. If you've looked at your nation and you've identified that you're very vulnerable early, or maybe you don't have a very strong mid-game, you may need to think about, what kind of mages do you recruit? Do you recruit mages that are very good at researching? Or do you recruit mages that are good at fighting in battles and then have them researching when they're not in a battle? Because if you're a weak nation in the mid-game, it would be very foolish to get mages who can only research, because the second somebody attacks you, you have no flexibility to then go get more battle mages who are going to be effective in combat. So even though it's less efficient for research, you need to do that to balance out your power curve. So before we move on to the next one, just a summary for balancing your power curve. You need to look at how the scales you pick, how the bless you pick is going to interact with what your research objectives are and what your playstyle is going to be, so that your nation is not particularly vulnerable to attack in the early, mid, or late game, right? You want to have many options and be very powerful in each of those phases of the game, ideally, to win. So anyway, that's kind of one of the frame of minds to think about this. The next topic is effective diplomacy. So what is effective diplomacy? What are the things we use diplomacy for? Well, one of the things we want to use it for is to control the game state to benefit ourselves. And the way we want to do that is only one person can win, and there's usually 8+ people in the game. So if you're the current game leader, you want to protect your lead. If you're not the game leader, which is likely because only 1 or 2 people is going to be the game leader at a given time, you usually want to conspire to weaken one of the game leaders. Or you can pick off a potentially weak neighbor so that you indeed could become a game leader. What you want to use diplomacy for is to position yourself to be in wars that you'll win decisively. Now that can be because you're attacking the right nation, a nation that strategically your nation's good against. It can be because you're ganging up against somebody, so it's 2v1, so they're going to have a difficult time countering you. You also want to keep yourself in and out of conflicts depending on your relative power to specific neighbors. So not only do you want to be in a war which you'll decisively win, but you don't really know how the war is going to go until you get into it. You want to use diplomacy to change your diplomatic situation if you're losing a war or if it's mutually destructive. If you're losing a war, you're often not going to be able to get out of it because the other person's having a lot of gains while it's only hurting you. So most people will not offer a truce. But if they're having to fully commit to you to have these gains, they may be very vulnerable on their flank. And then you could talk other people into attacking them. But if they're able to kill you with only, half of their army, while they're still able to keep a significant portion in the rear guarding their flank, and the war for them is not very expensive with you, they're almost never going to call a truce. So one of the best ways to get a truce is to make sure you're causing enough attrition to them where it would be in their interest to call peace with you instead of to continue the war or to get somebody to try to attack them if their flank is weak. But if neither of those are the case, if they have a strong flank, so nobody's going to attack them, and they're not losing much by attacking you, they're gaining things, then you're not going to be able to probably get out of that. The other main purpose of diplomacy is to protect your flank when you yourself are engaging in a war. So once you've positioned yourself to be in a war that you think you'll win decisively, you probably won't win it decisively if you're being attacked in your flank by your neighbors. Often what you'll want to do is to enter into a non-aggression pact with your neighbors before you enter into a war. And that will ensure you don't get backstabbed. But these non-aggression pacts are always non-binding, so people can always backstab you. Next, you'll want to collect intel on your neighbors. And what type of intel are you interested in? You're interested in what is the scripting, what is the composition of enemy armies, what is their research level, what paths do they have researched, so you can speculate on what types of spells they can cast. And then you want to see how they're actually scripting their armies. And you can get, hopefully, a lot of this through your own scout network where you're watching engagements, but some of it you'll get through talking with other players. And finally, you're looking for mutually beneficial trades, especially with non-leaders. So if there's a mutually beneficial trade, but it benefits the game leader, then usually that's not good because you want to bring the game leader down. So if you're not a game leader, you definitely want to trade with other non-game leaders, especially if the trades involve magic boosting items, because those can be very difficult to acquire if you don't have the right paths. You want to be very careful about who you give those to. But if you're going to trade magic path boosting items that would benefit a medium-sized nation, and you're a medium-sized nation, it's better that y'all both get powerful because you'll both get closer to the top, to the leading nation, and that's good for you. So anyway, those are the main points of diplomacy. And diplomacy is so important in this game. A lot of people are lazy and don't do it, but it's a key part to winning. The next big topic, and this is the biggest one in terms of the depth of it, is winning the economic war. If you haven't done diplomacy right and you're getting ganged up on, this part isn't going to matter as much. Because, and this is why it's in that order, because if you're not in the right engagements, fighting against the right nations, or you're getting ganged up on and you haven't done diplomacy well, then it's not really going to matter the strategy that you go about winning the economic war, unless you're very, very strong and you can handle potentially being in wars you shouldn't. So the first objective of having a strong economy and winning the economic war is you need to build that economy. You need to build an economy that you can easily defend. What are the ways you build economy? You build it by expanding well. You build it by putting up defensive capabilities, which is forts, and having troops in the right areas so that they can respond to attacks. And you build it by site searching, which is going to give you your gym income. And if you expand in a way that's very difficult to move your troops around through the terrain, it can be very hard to allocate troops correctly in your empire because you're having to guess where you get attacked, and somebody might commit 80% of their troops to attacking you in one area, and you only have 40% of your troops you can use to defend. And you might lose with 40, because 40% of yours can't respond to 80% of theirs, even if you're a stronger nation. And if the other part of your troops are so far away in your empire that it's going to take them forever to get there, then you're kind of outplayed. So thinking about what are the parts of your empire that you really are willing to defend and where do you put your troops so that you can pull them quickly if you need to is a really important part of winning the economic war. The next topic for winning the economic war is staying on the offensive in a military conflict. Dominions is a game that, while there are some advantages to playing on the defense, it heavily favors being on the offense once you enter into a war. And there's numerous advantages. One is that if you're fighting an enemy territory because you're attacking them, then every time there's a back and forth, like you take a land and then they take it back, you had one of their lands for part of your turn. Like you had it for a turn. Whereas if they're attacking in your lands, then they have some of your land for turns. And if you're not able to retake everything every turn that somebody takes it from you, then you're essentially somewhat permanently losing economy. So it definitely pays to be on the offensive because it's going to grind your opponent's economy into the ground, while it's going to strengthen yours so you will be more easily able to replenish troop losses you have. And there's another advantage too, which is when you're attacking, your opponent has to predict where you're going to go. So you may have 4 different provinces you can attack. They have one army they can defend with. They have to guess where you're going to go. So the odds may not be in their favor. They may only have a 25% chance of guessing correctly. Whereas if you're on the defensive, you're stuck with the odds of, okay, he's running through my lands. Where do I think he's going to move next? Let's guess. And your guess is going to be wrong 75% of the time. So there's a strong reason to be on the offensive. Now, when it comes to what are your actual tactics to winning the economic war, you want to take and hold territory while minimizing your losses. So the tactics to rapidly take territory are not moving one big army through an enemy territory. Because if you have one big army moving through, you're going to be taking territory very slowly. This isn't how you're going to conquer the world. So nations that want to win the economic war need to have ways to take territory quickly. And generally this is called raiding. So raiding is when you have efficient numbers of troops to quickly take enemy provinces. Types of troops you usually use are flyers, stealthy units, elites, thugs, and super combatants. And they need to be sized to deal with the type of province defense they're likely going to run into. And often when you start an engagement and you start raiding, you usually want a critical number of raiders where you're taking provinces at a rate quickly enough where the enemy can't retake them all that turn. So if you take 6 provinces but they can only retake 4, and the next turn you take another 6 and they can only retake 4, then you've essentially permanently gained 4 provinces, or permanently in the sense of this conflict. So that's how you're going to start winning the economic war. A trick to raiding well is avoiding counter-raiders, and there's a lot that goes into that. We're not going to talk about that now. Another trick is being unpredictable. If your enemy knows where you're going to raid, it's going to be very easy for them to put troops there to meet your small raiders, and what was going to be an economic win for you by taking their territory turns into an economic loss because not only do you not get the territory you were going to conquer, but you lose all of your raiders. So moving your raiding parties where they're not predictable, and sometimes that means not even attacking, or sometimes that means pooling all your raiders together in a province, is an important part of raiding. Another tactic in raiding is you want to isolate provinces from enemy forts, because even if you don't take a province, but it doesn't have a path of ownership it can trace back to a fort, then the enemy will not collect income from it, and it will help grind their income into the ground. The next topic for winning the economic war is counter-raiding. So how vulnerable are you to enemy raiding? How efficiently can you kill enemy raiders? And how quickly can you retake provinces once enemies have raided them? And oftentimes when enemies raid you, they will put very few PD in the provinces because they're not necessarily expecting to hold it. But you never know, they might. They might dump 40 province defense in it right before they leave. So there's some uncertainty there. The best way to counter-raid is magic phase attacks because you can catch somebody before they have a chance to leave. So magic phase attacks are using spells like Cloud Trapeze and Teleport, and that will guarantee that you land and force an attack on an enemy raider. It doesn't work on stealthy units if they're sneaking out, but it is one of the strongest counter-raiding tactics. One of the other very strong counter-raiding tactics is using direct damage remote spells like Mind Hunt or a Seeking Arrow, and then other assassination spells like Infernal Disease, and there's Earth Attack, and there's quite a few of those. But using those will kill the commander, and it will leave the raiding party stranded so that you can have an army come in and pick it off, and then you don't have to worry about guessing where they're going to be. You just walk in and kill it. Another important part of raiding is being good at anticipating your opponent's attacks, but there are limits as to how good you can be at actually anticipating where they're going to move. Finally, if you're dealing with stealthy raiders, you need to have mechanisms to efficiently patrol your provinces, because the way you raid with stealthy units is you attack, and then often you sneak out of the province you attacked into a different province, and you're sneaking there. And what you do not want to have happen is you don't want to sneak into a province where the enemy is currently patrolling, because then a battle will ensue, and you'll fight the people who are patrolling in addition to the province defense of that province. So if you have a good mechanism to patrol a lot, it makes it very hard for stealthy raiders to do their work. And then the more forts you have up too, you're also less vulnerable to raiding, because while raiders can sit on top of a fort and shut down production, they won't take ownership, and they won't easily be able to break through your fort walls. And finally, you can do PD splurges depending on who you're fighting. Putting a large amount of PD may be a good way to kill off anticipated raiders. And oftentimes, even though PD is very expensive, especially at higher levels, it can be worth it if you consider the economic damage you do to your opponent if you do manage to catch some of his raiders. So yeah, being able to counter raid effectively is an extremely important part of winning an economic war. So when you're looking at your power curve too, you need to think about how am I going to counter raid at different phases in the game? And then conversely, how do I raid at different phases of the game? So one thing you might do is you might take Astral on your Pretender so that you can Mind Hunt, if you're expecting that would be a good counter to the types of raiding you expect to see given who your opponents are. You might also pick Cloud Trapeze on your Pretender if you don't have any other magic phase attacks that your nation can do well, because just having one super combatant who can jump around cloud trapezing early in the game on top of raiders will make your nation very difficult to raid, and it'll make it very expensive to raid. Okay, so next we're going to talk about attrition. Attrition is a huge part of winning the economic war. Attrition is how many troops you lose after each of the conflicts. One way you can do this is you can take the battle report at the end, and you can count how many troops each side lost, and then multiply that by what's the average cost of troops on each side, and that will tell you how much gold each side lost. And ideally you want, obviously, your opponent to take more gold losses in a conflict than you do. But that's not the only factor, because if your opponent has a much bigger economy than you, then even if they take greater losses, or they may be in a much better position to replenish the losses that they do take. So while being able to inflict attrition is an important part of winning the economic war, it's important to understand that attrition is relative to the size of your economy. So I've definitely lost games where I've won essentially all of the major battles, but I lost the raiding battle and therefore had a weaker economy. Even though I won all the major battles, he did inflict some losses, and those losses he inflicted I was not able to replenish as quickly as he was able to replenish his, because he had won the economic war, and he had a bigger economy than me. But still, being able to inflict attrition was an important argument for potentially reaching peace, which in this particular game I'm thinking of, I wasn't able to reach peace, but it certainly provided an incentive for him to reach peace with me if that was something he thought he wanted to do, which he did not. And finally, the last part of winning the economic war is efficiently taking infrastructure. So infrastructure is stuff like forts and temples and labs. If you take a province that has an enemy temple in it, it automatically gets destroyed. So those are high value targets for raiding. Next is when we're talking about forts, you want to ideally take them very quickly. You don't want to sit on a fort for a long time, because it's going to tie up your army, which represents a large investment for you, which you don't want to be. You want it out doing work. You don't want it sitting on a fort. And sitting on a fort for a long period of time can be really crippling. Not only are you paying upkeep, you're essentially getting delayed while the diplomatic circumstances can all change. And while you thought you had a protected flank, that protected flank is no longer protected. Your allies can turn on you as they see you've gotten very strong from eating this other nation and now taking their capital. So if you sit on somebody's capital for a year, that is a perfect recipe for having your once allies turn on you and want to eat you while you're still fully committed to taking this capital, and all your armies are over there not defending your lands. It's something you need to think about when you go to a war, and especially when you siege a fort. Are you able to take the fort? And if you're not able to take it quickly, usually within a few months, you often don't want to take it. One important exception to that is if you have a small group of elite troops, which aren't very costly for you to have, but you can get them on top of a fort and they can't easily be pushed off by the people inside the fort, then sometimes you just want to sit them on top of that fort to shut down production. This is particularly relevant for an enemy's capital. If you can sit on an enemy's capital, they can't recruit any of their capital-only units. And for some nations, that can be totally devastating. So you may sit on top of a fort not to actually get inside of it, but just to shut that unit production down. And the last thing we're going to talk about, and this is getting to be somewhat of a longer video, is winning battles. And for a lot of people, this is the first thing they think about when playing Dominions, is how do I win battles? Winning battles, well, is really dependent on everything above it. If you're not winning the economic war, it's going to hard to be able to reliably win battles. You may win the first one or two, but eventually the greater economy is probably going to win. And then if you're in the wrong war with the wrong person, it's going to be hard to win battles because they will have an advantage on you. Or you're fighting multiple people, your armies are going to be split up. So anyway, I'm just re-emphasizing that all the things we talked about before this are actually kind of more important. But onto the actual topic of winning battles. The first key to winning battles is having good intelligence. And this is something I'm not particularly great at. I always am kind of cheap with my scouting network. But you really want good intelligence. You want to know where armies are. You want to know what the kind of troops are in them and what their scripting is. So this is really important. The next topic is you want to correctly anticipate enemy moves. Where do we think the enemy is going to move? And we want to appropriately size our forces to decisively win major battles. So how big your forces are and where you move them is a huge part of winning battles before we even talk about troop composition or scripting or anything like that inside your army. Bringing the right amount of troops to the job where you'll win is really good. To do this well, this is where you kind of need some experience because you'll need some intuition for how different armies will fare when they face up against each other to know how many troops you need to bring and how much of your troops you can split off to either raid or to potentially fight another enemy army. And then you need to bring the right tools to the job once you have the appropriately sized force. You need to know what is their army vulnerable to, what will strengthen your army, what are the buffs that you have access to. And once you have access to buffs, you definitely want to try to be putting them on your troops as much as you can. And how much mage support do you need to bring? A lot of times people are too stingy with mage support. I'm often too stingy with mage support. One of the great benefits of playing a flying nation is you can quickly move your mages in and out of armies. Whereas with larger land-based armies, it can take several turns to get mages to where they need to be efficiently used as part of an army. And a lot of times committing mages to an army for land-based armies is essentially a permanent commitment. Deciding correctly how much mage support you need is an important component. And if you don't bring enough mages, it can cost you losing a major fight. And losing a major fight can cost you a huge portion of your empire. So this is an extremely important decision. How many mages do you bring to a fight? Now, obviously, you shouldn't bring them until they have something useful they can do. So they need to get some research done first. Next is don't be lazy with scripting or stingy with gems for key fights. Bring gems to drop important spells. A lot of newer players won't put gems on mages to cast some of the important spells. But make sure you bring gems for the important spells that your nation has access to that will be useful in a fight. And often you want to bring extra gems on a scout or something hidden so you can replenish stocks if you have to fight multiple fights. Now, you do need to be a little careful with how many gems you want to use for smaller encounters that you think you will win decisively without using gems. But yeah, for big fights, you definitely want to make sure you're doing no holds barred. And then scripting, don't be lazy. Put your troops in the correct formation. We'll talk more about that when we get into the next videos. But script your mages well, space your troops out correctly, all of that stuff. The next thing about winning battles is understanding some of the rock, paper, scissors with troop size. So smaller armies are typically countered by larger armies. If somebody's raiding you with a small army, you typically want to move a medium-sized army in to eat them. And if you know that somebody is trying to counter your raiders by moving medium-sized armies in, one thing you can do to counter them is all of a sudden to move a large army in, because a large army is going to eat a medium army. You can see where this kind of progresses, and all of a sudden, if this is happening, well, the only way you can protect yourself from a large army potentially jumping in on any of the medium armies is you always move a large army around. And this is called a death ball, where you essentially put all your troops in one army because you're worried about them getting picked off by the enemy using even bigger armies. So deathballing is a tendency. I see newer players doing it a lot, and that doesn't mean it's the wrong strategy. A lot of times deathballing is a good option, but you need to understand what it's good against. A deathball is good when you're using it to fight large or medium armies where you expect you'll win. If you think the army that your opponent has, if they chose to deathball, would deathball better than you could, then you choosing to deathball is actually probably a big problem because you're going to force a fight inevitably. Maybe not this turn. Maybe you'll get one win, so you can deathball for a turn. But if you keep deathballing, you're eventually going to force a fight that you'll probably lose. So you need to think about that. Meanwhile, deathballing is not the only option because when you deathball, when you put all or most of your troops in one big force, you become very vulnerable to raiding. So if your opponent deathballs and will beat yours, don't do a head-on fight, instead resort to raiding, or do many small armies, and then he'll have to split up into medium armies to fight yours. And so this is a rock, paper, scissors that can go on in fights where army composition shifts around. So it's important that you're reacting dynamically to this and not doing deathball or bust. We're not doing small or bust. You need to react to what you anticipate your enemy's army size to be and what the relative strengths and weaknesses of your armies are. In general, the counter to small armies is medium armies, the counter to medium armies is large armies, and the counter to large armies is small armies. So that's the rock, paper, scissors there. And the other thing is later in the game, death balls are countered by battlefield-wide evocations. Like Earthquake or Rain of Stones or Firestorm or Winds of Death. Death balls definitely go out of fashion as the game goes very late. Some other final thoughts, and then we'll end it for this overview, is that if we talk about how do you win battles in general in the early, mid, and late game, the early game battles are largely determined by the number of troops that you're able to bring to a battle, the quality of those troops, the bless you have, and whether you have an awake pretender. That is what's going to determine, usually, your early game power. Your mid-game battles are largely going to be determined by the number and quantity of troops, combined with how many mages you're bringing, with the types of evocations or other type of battlefield spells that they're casting, and then also kind of some small buffing. What super combatants are in play, because you can start having some super combatants pop out in mid-game, and then also thugs can be a major factor in winning mid-game battles. The big shift between mid-game and early game is you start having a lot of battlefield magic come online. It's not usually battlefield-wide magic, it's usually kind of evocations and things like Skelly Spam and things like that. And late game battles are largely determined by how many elite troops you're bringing. Chaff is usually much less valuable, combined with what kinds of battlefield-wide spells you're bringing to the table. So much less so how many just mages dropping evocation, though that's still a factor. It has much more to do with doing big battlefield-wide buffs, and then bringing big super combatants who are either casting big spells or wading into combat themselves, and then also super elite thugs who are kind of doing a lot of damage. Another key component kind of behind all of that is your magic diversity, which is going to determine what types of spells you can cast, is going to be a huge factor in how effectively you're able to fight late game battles. For example, if you're not a nation that has air access and you're fighting a nation with fog warriors, unless you have the specific tools to deal with fog warriors, you're going to be at a severe disadvantage. So you can either develop those tools or you can have fog warriors yourself. And then very late game, if you can't cast any of the big earth alteration skills like Army of Lead or Gold, you're going to be at a strong disadvantage. So making sure you have that path access for major battles by the late game is very important. Those are kind of ways to think about how do you win early, mid-game, late-game battles. If you're trying to fight a mid-game battle and you're doing early-game stuff, like just bringing a ton of troops, and maybe you have a good bless, but your enemy now has also pretty good troops, maybe about as good as yours, but they're also bringing a lot of mages that are dropping really good spells, then you're going to lose, because you're bringing an early-game army to a mid-game fight. Meanwhile, if you bring a mid-game army to a late-game fight, you have a bunch of mages dropping spells, but they're bringing in big battlefield wipe spells, yeah, you're going to lose that army, most likely. So that's kind of a framework for thinking about strategy in general. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it useful. I don't pretend to be the best or anything at multiplayer. I certainly lose plenty and plenty of games, but I've played it a lot and I feel like I have a pretty good handle on it. If you guys leave your thoughts and comments below, I will try to incorporate some of them and maybe an addendum after I get through the next 3 that I was planning. Maybe I'll do like an update including some kind of tips and tricks from all of you. So thanks so much for listening and hope to see you in a game.